Hi everyone! So last week's video covered a couple of reasons as to why you might not be getting better at writing. And this week's video is going to be covering the basics, at least in my opinion, of quality writing. So let's jump right into the basics of writing. And of course, these are just coming from my opinion of what I think. It's not limited to just these things, but these are some of the major things that I notice in work that I might be critiquing or that I personally notice in my old work when I was first beginning or when I was first trying to grasp the basics. So quality writing knows when to use scene versus narrative summary. So scene is essentially where characters are interacting with their environment or conversing. It's necessary because it's the action of your book. So to sort of like really quickly explain what a scene is, it's when your character describes what they're doing as it's essentially occurring in the book. So narrative summary, on the other hand, is exactly what it sounds like. It's when your narrator summarizes events or feelings instead of immersing you into a scene. So how I like to think of it is to think of a scene as a scene in a movie and narrative summary as like the voiceover in a movie. So balanced quality writing will actually incorporate both. So a lot of new writers or writers still trying to develop their voices, and I did this a lot when I was first starting out, will actually write exclusively in narrative summary and not even realize it. Narrative summary kind of mimics how we tell stories, like orally. I'm talking to my mom. Yeah, so I went to the store and then I said hello to a friend that I saw at the store, and then I went and I bought some green tea. I'm not actually doing those things when I'm recounting the story to my mom. I'm summarizing it to her. It's normal that a lot of writers will kind of default to writing in just summary and not incorporate scene. Scene is going to follow a character. So for example, me in the grocery store, I would describe. I walked to the tea aisle. My head pounded. I had been struggling with a migraine all morning. I reached up to the shelf and I grabbed my favorite box of Chinese green tea. So great writing is also going to utilize specific and concrete language. For example, you're not so heartbroken because your boyfriend broke up with you that your heart is shattering into thousands of fractals. Instead, you're eating bacon and cheese stuffed pierogies while cutting up the Home Alone ticket stub from your first date. I don't know if you can see the difference between the two examples, but the first example, your heart is shattering into thousands of fractals, is quite abstract. There's no concrete detail really there. Heart is essentially being used in an abstract way here because hearts can't actually shatter into thousands of fractals. Instead, specific and concrete language. The specific language here is you're eating bacon and cheese stuffed pierogies. So, we're learning what kind of pierogies it's bacon and cheese stuffed. And you're also cutting up the Home Alone, that's the type of movie, ticket stub. It's specifically a ticket stub from your first date. So the concrete way of describing this feeling of heartbreak, rather than saying my chest burst into thousands of fractals, is to sit there and cut up this ticket stub that once meant so much to you. You kept it the whole time on your first date, and then you decided to cut it up. So clearly you're quite upset and heartbroken. If you read published stories like on literary magazines or even a novel, you're going to notice that a lot of novels or short stories that are published will integrate quite specific and quite concrete language because this allows all readers to understand your vision. So specificity is going to create universality. So another mark of quality writing is that it avoids overwritten prose, which can often manifest as purple prose. Overwritten prose can look like writing that over-explains itself. For example, writing that repeats its details and writing that lacks concrete details. So the example from before with the heart shattering into million fractals, that's overwritten. It's using a lot of words to not tell us anything because we don't really understand what that means. Quality writing will also avoid underwritten prose, which can often look like a lack of exposition. Writers, when they're first starting out, and I did this so much, can often avoid stating facts or information in their work for fear of over-explaining their world to the readers. In many instances, stating the exposition in like a really concise, like one sentence, is much better than sending a reader on like a goose chase for like 12 pages or like 120 pages, depending on what kind of story you're writing, if it's a short story or a novel or a novelette or a novella or whatever you're writing, for them to understand what you're trying to write. I would prefer that a writer just tells me, I was feeling really upset that he said that to me, me rather than say, my heart was bursting into a million fractals. I'm sorry to keep going back to that example. So exposition is not a bad thing. Stories need exposition. I know a lot of writers are scared out of using exposition because there's like a lot of writing advice of like info dumping and stuff. And I will link my video on more tips that I wish I knew when I was a new writer. And I talk about sort of exposition versus info dumping and the difference, because you need exposition to tell a story. It is extremely critical. You can't tell a story without exposition. At least it might be very difficult and your reader might be quite confused. Exposition basically tells a reader the kind of story they're in for, the kind of story they should expect, the details they really need to understand. So a couple of tips to combat underwriting. So have you oriented the reader in location, in time? And if you haven't, maybe take a moment to describe the setting, including the situation your character is currently in. Include chronology tags when necessary. That's a really big one. Tell us where in time the story is currently taking place. Give readers the exposition you think they'll need on a cold read, so essentially reading it for the first time. You can always pull overly explanatory lines or language later, like in revisions. Readers will not be able to piece together your story without that information. So good writing will also prioritize clarity. So overlooking clarity can cause writing to become quite muddled. And that is because clarity is foundational to the creation of quality writing. After all, good writing is writing that will be understood. So have you provided readers with the necessary exposition for them to understand your story? Have you oriented the reader in your setting rather than assuming that they understand your intent? Is your language tangled with details or confusing verbs or confusing adjectives competing for space alongside each other? Look at the line level. Perhaps ask a friend, somebody you trust, to read a paragraph of what you've written and then get them to report to you what they think occurred. Clarity will improve the longer you write. And I say that because my writing style can get quite figurative. It can be poetic. And when I was first trying to find my writing style, I went through this very necessary but painful like puberty in my writing, where my writing was like extremely poetic and very like beautiful and lush and figurative, but I could not understand even myself what the hell I was trying to say. So I'm going to link one of my line edit with me videos in particular. I filmed it when I was in first year and I was critiquing this section from Rewired, which is book 6 of Fostered, that I'd written, I think in like grade 12. And I had no idea what was happening, like me just like a year later rereading it. And I kind of revised it to make more sense. So I will link it because that excerpt in particular, I think might be helpful in illustrating how important clarity is. Good writing will also avoid using melodrama to build tension. So writing like my heart was going to explode, I could feel it pulsing in my fingertips, ready to drag me to hell, is very dramatic. A heart potentially exploding that is also sentient enough to literally drag a human being into hellfire sounds a little sus to me. So sometimes writers will opt to use melodrama as kind of like a shortcut for building tension in their work. And just that example, I have written a variation of that heart exploding sentence many, many, many times. And honestly, sometimes it's important to sort of go through the motions, write them down anyway. Instead, something I recommend if you do want to build tension in your work is to describe the physical sensation your character feels. So revert to the 5 senses. What can they hear? What can they smell? What can they taste? What can they feel? What do they see? So could you even reflect on some of their emotions? Go into the mind, talk about it, sort of use a little bit of narrative summary there. So check out my video on tips I wish I knew, again, as an early writer that I mentioned before, where I discuss how sometimes stating an emotion outright can sometimes be more effective than skirting around it. Good writing will also prioritize the active voice and avoid an overuse of the passive voice. Passive voice can slow down the pace of your writing. It can also make it quite difficult or a little bit arduous to read. So when you're looking at passive voice, look for constructions like I am verbing. Look for ing verbs in your manuscript and see if you can revise them to verbs that end in ed. If you can rephrase it, I highly recommend doing that. So instead of I was walking to the grocery store, I walked to the grocery store. I was blow drying my hair and listening to a Katy Perry song. Change it to I blow dried my hair as I listened to a Katy Perry song. Good writing will also vary in sentence structure and sentence length. So the same sentence structure over and over again in your writing can make your prose read as clunky. So when revising, look for pronoun verb constructions like I do this, I did that, I do this again, I walked to the store, I said hello to my mom, mother. I painted my nails. And note if your sentences are all of a similar length or a similar structure too consistently. So something to look out for, unless you're doing it purposefully, you might not want to start every single sentence with a pronoun verb construction. Like as I mentioned, I painted my nails. I drank my iced coffee. I listened to music. And that's because it sounds quite monotonous. I did this, I did this, I did this, I did this, instead of having a certain rhythm or flow. Varying the sentence length will also help with this. If sentences are all the exact same length, it's also going to create that monotonous sound. So when revising your writing, look to see if there are any sentences where you can kind of chop them up or slow them down or elongate them a little bit for more variety in the prose. So those are, in my opinion, the basics of really great writing, things that I slowly and quite painfully had to learn over years and years of practice. I hope that this video was helpful for you. If you have any questions about the topics that I spoke about in this video, ask me in the comments and I will get back to you. And if you want to see any more videos regarding writing basics, let me know if there's something in particular that you are struggling with or curious about, and I'll make a video on it. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in another one. Bye.